Most people are asking the same question right now. Why isn't XRP price moving even with all the adoption you're seeing? And what if the reason it hasn't moved is because you're watching the wrong signal entirely? Because if you're holding XRP expecting adoption to drive price, this is the part that changes how you see everything. And the reason XRP price isn't moving the way people expect is because the system isn't forcing demand into the coin. If you're new here, this is part of an ongoing series where we've been breaking down one core idea. The XRP ledger can grow without increasing demand for XRP the coin. And in the last episode, we took that one step further and showed why. Because for XRP to create strong, consistent demand, three things would need to happen. The system would need to consistently include it in transaction paths, consistently prefer it when routing value, and liquidity would need to concentrate around it. And right now, none of those exist in a consistent, system-wide way, so demand stays optional in most cases. This isn't just about XRP adoption. It's about what actually drives XRP price and why those two things aren't always the same. And this is the part nobody explains clearly, because most people are still looking at this through the wrong lens, watching adoption, watching partnerships, and watching activity across the XRP ledger. But adoption alone doesn't change structure, and if structure doesn't change, XRP price doesn't move the way people expect, which is why XRP price doesn't always follow adoption. What actually changes structure is pressure, specifically pressure at scale, because when small amounts of value move, the system can stay flexible with multiple paths and multiple assets, and nothing has to dominate. But when large-scale flows start moving across borders in high volume and under time-sensitive conditions, efficiency becomes much more important, and this is where it starts to break for most people, because what looks like growth on the surface doesn't always translate underneath, meaning you can have more activity, more partnerships, and more value moving, and still not create demand for XRP the coin, and that's the gap most people never see, which is why XRP price stays disconnected from adoption. When efficiency becomes the priority, systems start to converge toward the most effective paths available, not because they're forced to, but because one path may consistently outperform others under certain conditions. And that's the first real signal, not just that XRP is being used, but that it starts being selected more consistently when value moves, not occasionally, or in isolated cases, but repeatedly under similar conditions. Because once a system starts choosing the same path more often, that path becomes more important in how value moves, and that's where demand can begin to build. And this is where most people realize they've been reading this wrong. The second signal is liquidity. Because value doesn't just move through systems, it tends to move where liquidity is deeper and execution is more efficient. So if XRP the coin begins to develop stronger liquidity across major corridors, it can influence routing decisions, not because it's required in every case, but because it may become a more efficient option in certain situations. And when liquidity improves, it can attract more flow, which is when usage has a greater chance of translating into demand. This is where it gets even more important, because even when XRP is part of the system, it doesn't mean it's the asset actually carrying the value, and that distinction is what separates people who understand what's happening from people who are just reacting to headlines. The third signal is how integrations are designed, because systems don't just use assets, they define how they are used. And if XRP is one option among many, demand remains situational. But if certain integrations are designed in a way that makes XRP a more efficient or preferred settlement asset, then its role in the system can increase, and that's when structure begins to shift. Now here's why this matters, because these changes don't show up in price first, they show up in behavior, in routing patterns, in liquidity conditions, and in how systems begin to favor certain paths more often than others. And by the time price reflects those changes, much of that shift has already been happening underneath, which is why most people feel like price suddenly moved, but it didn't. They just weren't watching the right things. And this is where everything comes together, because once you understand how this system actually works, you stop reacting to headlines the same way. So when you see something like XRP moved $40 billion, what you're really seeing is value moving across the XRP ledger, not necessarily demand for XRP the coin as the asset carrying that value, because value can move through the system without requiring the asset. The same thing applies to partnerships, where a new integration, a new bank, or a new payment corridor are all signals of system growth, but they don't automatically mean demand for XRP the coin as a bridge asset unless the structure actually uses it in that role. And this is where a lot of confusion comes from, because people hear XRP and assume it always refers to the coin, when in reality, it often refers to the XRP ledger as a system. And while the technology and the asset are connected, they don't behave the same way. Once you start separating those two, your expectations start to change, and you stop assuming that every headline should move price, and instead you start asking a better question, which is whether the activity is actually increasing the likelihood that XRP is used as the asset carrying value, or if it's simply expanding the system, because unless the structure shifts in that direction, the outcome doesn't change, and that's the difference between system growth and demand for the asset. This isn't about whether XRP works, it's about how it is actually used within the system, because until the system begins to favor XRP more consistently in how value moves, demand remains dependent on conditions rather than guaranteed, and when that changes, everything changes. So in the next episode, we're going to take this one step further, and we're going to break down what would actually force those changes to happen in the real world. What kind of adoption would matter? What kind of players would have to be involved? And what kind of pressure would push the system from flexible to converging on one dominant path? Because once you see that, you won't just understand the system, you'll understand what would actually make it change.